Leo Baeck Institute's 70th anniversary lecture series. My name is Magda Vrobel, and I'm Associate Director of Public History in the Leo Baeck Institute, New York, Berlin. For those who were unable to join us for the previous lectures, I'm pleased to remind you that the Leo Baeck Institute is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. As part of the celebrations, LBI has launched a special series of 7 lectures, each exploring one key theme in German Jewish history through the lens of evolving historiography. So far, we had lectures on early modern politics, religion, and last month on migration. If you missed any of them, recording from those lectures is already available on the LBI's YouTube channel. After the lecture today, there are 2 more to come, Austria and gender. And today I'm very happy to welcome Professor Jonathan Zatlin, who will speak on economics. And few words about the speaker. Jonathan Zatlin is Associate Professor of History at Boston University. His early work explored the history of German communism, focusing on the social construction of value in East Germany to understand the terms of German unification. He's the author of The Currency of Socialism, Money and Political Culture in East Germany, published by Cambridge University Press 2007, and co-edited Selling Modernity, Advertising in 20th Century Germany, published by Duke University Press, also in 2007, with Jonathan Wiesen and Pamela Sweat, and New Directions in East German Historiography, German Yearbook for Contemporary History, Volume 9, with Dirk Hoffmann and Hermann Wendker. And more recently, he has written about popular conflations of Jews with injustice and the market in German history. He co-edited Dispossession, Plundering German Jewry, 1933-1945, published by University of Michigan Press, 2020, with Christoph Kreutzmüller. Jonathan is currently completing Fantasies of Jewish Wealth, 1790-1990, which will appear in the University of Chicago Press Intellectual History series. His articles and essays have been translated into French, German, and Hebrew. He's the recipient of the fellowships from the DAAD, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Mellon Foundation, and the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung. He has been active in professional organizations related to German and Jewish history, including the Academic Advisory Board of the Leo Baeck Institute, New York. After the lecture, there will be also time for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A box that you can see above the screen. I would also like to mention that only questions directly related to the topic of the lecture will have a chance to be answered in the Q&A session. And now, finally, Jonathan, I'm really looking forward to the lecture, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Magda. Thanks for the somewhat long introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's go ahead and do that. There we go. Is that working okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I thought, time permitting, that I would try and speak to 2 totally interrelated but very different issues and divide my talk into 2 sections. First, cover arguments both in terms of actual history and historiography that represent Jews as greedy, and then discuss arguments about generosity as a way to flip the script, so to speak. So I'm going to cover some ground that you're probably familiar with, but I want to start by saying that when I'm going through all of these, often it's highly racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. I'm asking myself the question, what sorts of work do these kinds of arguments do? What do they explain for us, especially when it comes to economics? So keep that in mind when we're working through this material. So I want to start by talking about Christian arguments about Jews being greedy. Now, in the antique world, before Christianity, there were arguments also that Jews were somehow or another greedy, and it's really hard to know what they were based on. In part, it could have been Jewish texts, the story of the calf um, at Har Sinai. You know, there's all sorts of reasons that people had perhaps to talk about that. But I think it would, for the German context, make more sense to start with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. So the challenge to Christianity, of course, is that it comes out of Judaism, must distinguish itself from Judaism. There's this notion of supersessionism. It has surpassed or superseded Judaism. It is the New Testament, the New Covenant, and it has. That's why halacha and aspects of rabbinic Judaism are no longer relevant from a Christian perspective. Well, the problem is that Jews don't convert, and the failure of Jews to convert is something that troubles a lot of Christian theologians for quite some time. One of the arguments that they make, and there are a lot of different arguments, but one of them is that simply that Jews are blind to the truth, and more specifically, Jews confuse worldly gain with spiritual riches. Right? So this idea that Jews are more focused not simply on the here and now, but on material things and not on what really matters, which would be the kingdom of God. And there are stories in the Gospels, such as the story of Judas and the 30 pieces of silver, that are used to fit that particular argument. It also goes hand in hand with an older argument from the antique world. Aristotle makes this argument that you can't make money from money. Money cannot beget money. There's something unnatural about that. And Jews supposedly don't have a problem with lending money. And from a Christian perspective, there's an added layer. God is eternal, so time is the kingdom of God. And what Jews are doing if they lend money is trading on time, which is a form of blasphemy. So in order to mark Jews, the church more or less says that Christians can't do that. You can't use time to make money. But Jews, because they're not Christian, because they're damned, can do that. And there's this idea that people have that the only people who are involved in usury, which is simply lending money at a very high rate, because markets in the medieval and in the early modern period are very illiquid, so the interest rates tend to be very high. The only people who do that are Jews. So if I just would take a quotation from Martin Luther's book on the Jews and their lies, which he writes after Jews fail to convert to Protestantism. The hope is that they will, and that it's a kind of true Christianity that will finally attract Jews, and they're not attracted to it. Among other things, Luther says, quote, "No people under the sun is greedier than they were, still are, and always will be, as is evident from their accursed usury. And they comfort themselves that when their Messiah comes, he will take all the gold and silver in the world and divide it amongst them." Well, I don't know where he gets, I don't know what his source is for this notion that the Jewish Messiah would do that, but it is an expression of an idea that I was listening before I got online to rap star Jay-Z, and he has a song called "The Story of OJ," and in it he says that Jews own all the property in America, and how do they do it? They do it through credit. In other words, through lending. So it's a very pervasive idea, and I think it's one that is still with us. So let me see if I can go to the next slide. By the time you get to the 18th century, though, there's a new series of ideas that are really scholarly. One should always be careful of scholars. That is also trying to talk about why it is that Jews are different. Now, the argument that we could make is simply that Jews are made to be different by restrictive legal regimes and things like that. But for better or worse, it's actually not from biology and the natural sciences this comes. It comes from linguistics, this notion that there are Indo-European languages versus, for example, Semitic languages. Where does the word Semitic come from? Well, it comes from one of Noah's sons, Shem, and the idea is that Shem is the what would you say, the father of Arabs, Jews, people who speak this particular set of languages. But what's important for us, I'll just note, is that it's a biblical category, which makes absolutely no sense in a scholarly way. And that's where the name comes from. and it was a way of basically marking Jews as non-European. But over time, you get this addition of biology, this notion that Jewish bodies in particular are bad. So if you take a look at this, this is a postcard. It's actually at a particular maybe obscene level. It's a bit funny, but the German is vom Geier zum Meyer, so from a vulture to a Jewish man named Meyer. And the idea isn't simply that he kind of somehow or another resembles this bird, but that vulture-like behavior that, say, Shylock exhibits, this notion that you lend no matter what, and you demand what you are due no matter what is happening to the person who you lent to, that there's something about that that is part of the Jewish body. And that is a really very important aspect of German culture. I'll give you another example. Germans still have this adage, I would say. It's called, krause Haare, krause Gedanken, kinky hair, kinky thoughts. So the idea is somehow or another that your body determines your behavior. Now I want to talk I'm going to add a little bit as we go on, sprinkle some of my own work. In this case, it's this man, Ernst Henrici, who was born too young to actually take part in the war against France. And so there's for that generation, the sense of having missed out on something glorious. And he becomes, he's a liberal in the beginning, becomes violently anti-Semitic. He's a very good speaker, attracts huge crowds, and is an agitator that basically starts anti-Semitic riots in Western Prussia. And these riots are really quite serious, actually. And they've been, I would argue, overlooked by a lot of the literature. It leads not only to whole towns being burned down and synagogues being burned down and Jews being blamed for burning their own synagogues down, but a lot of the looting that takes place is looting of what are regarded as Jewish stores. And on the one hand, it leads to Jews leaving Western Prussia, small towns where they used to live, and going either to Berlin or to other larger towns, or alternatively to the Americas. So it really, if you like, makes that part of Germany Jew-free. And that is precisely what Henrici is interested in. And the other thing that I should probably say about Henrici is that some Nazis look back to him and couldn't try to explain why it is that he wasn't Hitler. And part of that was about his personality, and the other part was that the Germans were not anti-Semitic enough, and they would become sufficiently anti-Semitic by Weimar in order to be more responsive to National Socialism. In any case, he's a really interesting figure. You can see from this picture, it looks to me like it's a studio portrait, and there's a superimposed young boy, an African boy, that's why it looks a bit odd. I think it's just a sort of not a double exposure, but a superimposition, and that he's actually in some kind of colonial getup, but in Berlin. That's where the picture was taken. He turns out to be extends his anti-Semitism to racism in Africa, tries to make a go of it as a plantation owner. In any case, one of the things that's important about Henrici is that he is making an argument that there's no way that Jews can convert. If their bodies are different than Christian bodies, there's no way that you can possibly wash those sins away. So let me give you a quotation from one of a very large crowd that he spoke to in January of 1881. The Jew remains a Jew even when he is baptized. After all, water doesn't work. And just as he cannot change the shape of his body, he is unable to transform his own spirit. Again, this confusion between what is spiritual and what is material. The attempt to convert Jews to Christianity is completely misdirected. If not even Jesus could convert this riffraff, then we can just give up on it. So one of the things that this, and this is important in terms of the historiography, scholars make a difference between Christian anti-Judaism, which is really directed against the religion very often, even though it sometimes ends up being about individual Jews. And now you've moved from the body of belief to the body of the believer. You are now somehow or another, your body is going to determine your behavior. And since you can't convert because your body can't be changed, therefore there is no way to integrate Jews. And in fact, Henrici is all for expelling the Jews. and talks quite a bit about the need to forcibly do that. So why is all this going on? Well, to some extent, it's because Jews are actually becoming more prosperous. So many Jews were itinerant peddlers. Why was that? Because they weren't allowed to live in German towns and cities. And if they could, the restrictions on them were tremendous. And in terms of peddling, it's just what you had and what you could sell. So this is not all Jews by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a significant portion of people who have to sell either the skill set they have, such as working with your hands, tailoring, and things like that, but go from city to city and hope that they can reside for a while if they can pay the taxes or if there is some kind of tolerance. What happens over time, though, is that you get manufacturing, and people have enough disposable income to purchase consumer goods. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that there's a significant portion of the Jewish population in Germany that had some retail experience, this peddling. And it does translate, because once they are allowed to reside in German cities, and that happens really between 1815 and all of the laws are changed in 1842 throughout Prussia and then other German states, Jews are allowed to simply live. They can settle and they can parlay the skills that maybe their parents had or that they had into retail trade. The other thing that happens, of course, is that manufacturing requires all kinds of quantitative skills, not qualitative. It's all about measurement and things like that. So if you're good at math, if you're good at engineering, if you can make things, devices and what have you, then even if people don't like who you are and where you came from, there's an objective artifact that you have created. There's something objective that nobody can dispute. So it makes it actually easier, even though Jews are actually discriminated against, for them to demonstrate their talents or their interests. And that's part of the reason they go into various kinds of STEM-related fields. And then finally, there's just this general relaxation of legal restrictions on Jewish economic activity. But as Jews are becoming more prosperous, entering the middle class, a lot of Germans see this as a conflict. Like they imagine that prosperity is a pie that won't grow larger, but that simply is it's a zero-sum game. So if Jews get more, that means they get less. And so one of the ways in which they try to explain this is to think about Jews, and here you see another postcard. I should mention the reason I'm using postcards is that they were the TikToks of the time. They were really, people would not only buy postcards and send them to each other, but it was how you communicated. If you wanted to eat dinner, the postal service in many German cities was so good that you could write a postcard at 10 o'clock in the morning and the other person would get it by the afternoon. And this is how you would arrange to meet each other. So it's a really important form of communication. But you see that there's a sub-genre that is all about anti-Semitism. And what it depicts is this idea that there's something clannish about Jews, but that they're really focused on money, either the bags that go around the money or the money that goes into the bags. And there's something not only international and conspiratorial about it, but this idea that they are doing something that's illicit, dishonest, and that's why they have become wealthy. And that is a huge source for a lot of people. Capitalism has become this really complicated thing. It's very hard, even for economists at this point, to really understand how things work. And when I say market failure, what I mean is depressions, recessions, and of course, when you get to Weimar, hyperinflations. People don't really understand how they work. And it's easier to talk about the social displacement that you experience, not as a function of the problems that capitalism might have, the business cycle or what have you, but of certain kinds of people. And Jews, given this prior Christian tradition of thinking of them as greedy, serve very well for these kinds of explanations. But I would argue, and here I'm going to just push back a little bit against the scholarship, that this division between Christian anti-Semitism and racial anti-Semitism is, I think, a little bit too hard and fast. In fact, Christian scholars and theologians, thinkers were always focused on Jewish bodies. I mean, you have this early quote from Luther that Jewish breath stinks of pagan gold and silver. That he says other things that are about the Jewish body. I would pick out Andreas Eisenmenger, who is a source for a lot of anti-Semites. He basically spends a couple of years pretending he's Jewish and learns Hebrew and Aramaic and spends time learning about the Talmud, and then writes a two-tome volume that is basically an insider's view. But what it does is completely misread, either contextually misread, jumble things together, or he just doesn't understand what he's talking about or takes things absolutely literally. So it's really just a huge anti-Semitic diatribe. But what he is focused on isn't simply that the Talmud tells Jews that they should rip Christians off, which is not true. So there are outright lies in there. He also talks about Jewish women as being sexually depraved, Jews as cannibals. So there's all this sort of uh, very strange and I would say lascivious mention of the Jewish body. We could go on and point out that, for example, Riel, who wrote this book, German Work, which was a best-selling book and highly influential. You have everyone from Nietzsche to Max Weber and Werner Sombart responding to it. He basically is also interested in racism, but he focuses on Christianity. So let me just give you a quotation from Riel. He says, "The New Testament demonstrates that the moral force of tackling work, not profits and wages, confirms human dignity." So this notion that Germans are industrious and work hard and are honest. Nothing discusses a genuinely German temperament more than haggling, profiteering, or the love of money. Now, he doesn't even have to say Jews, because his audience would know immediately. Christian consciousness has discovered an affinity in German national consciousness. So to be German means to be Christian, and that is a dividing line that for a man who is actually a racist is rather odd. He's not making it a question of the formation of the body or the way that German muscles function and German Jewish muscles don't function, or honesty and dishonesty. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that hard and fast difference that people like to make between Christian anti-Semitism and racial or biological anti-Semitism, I don't see it as being quite as hard and fast. So if we continue to move forward, though, we can talk about Werner Sombart's book, The Jews and Modern Capitalism, as a watershed moment. The book is in some ways a response to Max Weber's famous book, The Protestant Ethic, in which he basically argues that certain kinds of Protestants are the reason that you get capitalism. And Sombart responds by saying, no, capitalism is a Jewish invention. He has all kinds of reasons for this. One is he says that Jews are racially disposed to like money. He says, for example, the be-all and end-all of economic activity in a capitalistic system is money. Is it otherwise with the Jew? Does he not also make the increase of capital his chief aim? So there's something about the Jewish body again that lends itself to money. But he also repeats a lot of arguments that people have had about religion. He doesn't actually cite Eisenmenger, but he regurgitates Eisenmenger, this notion that the Talmud tells Jews that they should love money, which is just simply not true. He does introduce one new idea, and that is that Jews are focused on consumption. And that he tries to explain this boom in the retail sector that's going on throughout the Western industrialized world. And people who are profiting from both making textiles, selling textiles, and clothing and things like this, he tries to argue that Jews have sumptuary laws, kashrut, and certain aspects of halakha, and so they are more sensitized in some way to the notion that you should consume things. They're also, ostentatious, brash, nouveau riche, and what have you. So there's all sorts of older arguments about Jews wrapped up in this somewhat interesting, but still really problematic and hostile argument. He introduces another idea that is an old idea, but he gives it a sort of new twist. He says Jews are a nomadic people. And it's true that Jews, were forced to migrate quite a bit. They are dispersed. There's a diaspora, and a lot of, especially in Christian countries, there's a lot of hostility to them settling down. So to some extent, Jews might have been originally nomadic. They are forced to be non-sessile by hostile German laws. But at this point, the turn of the 20th century, that's no longer true. So somehow or another, once again, there's some kind of intergenerational transmission of something through the body or through Judaism that gives Jews a nomadic quality. And the reason for Zumbat that that's important is that if you're a nomad, then you don't really own much, but you have money that you can take with you just in case somebody tries to do something to you. So there's some kind of connection between nomadic peoples and valuables, gold, what have you. It's a bit of an odd argument, but it's very clever. Um, Finally, he says that it's the nomadic aspect of Jews that is responsible for the diffusion of capitalism throughout the world. This is one of the things that people are starting to try to explain. It happens first in Great Britain and Northern France. It comes to Germany and America. There's this new way that people are making, so in our Constitution, it says that certain rights are inalienable. And what that means is you can't sell them. There's this new way of dealing with economics in which you can sell everything, including land, which used to be a question of inheritance rather than something that could be sold. So in order to explain how this is taking over the world, what Zumbat says is that it's because European Jewry is, quote, an ant heap into which a stick has been thrust, which is it's a pretty vulgar image. And the argument is that the shock of being discriminated against has made Jews go into the world and take with them this reduction of spiritual values to material values. And what's odd about this is this book, even though it's incredibly anti-Semitic, was well received by German Jews. And part of the reason is because he says capitalism is a Jewish invention. He's one of the first scholars in Germany to say, well, Jews did do something. It's not just that they're non-productive, don't work with their hands, and are just greedy. They invented capitalism. And there are plenty of people who like capitalism and think it's a good thing. And so a lot of German Jews say, well, look, he's saying that we're productive, we're good citizens because Germany is a capitalist country. So I think they overlook, or let's say that there's an internalized anti-Semitism that makes them feel more kind to this book than they should. So I would argue that that's kind of the last major statement, if you like, until you get to 1945. And the arguments that are made after 1945 about Jews is that it's all about discrimination. Now, you could call this a liberal argument, if you like, because it goes back to arguments about Jewish emancipation. And the argument is that Jews are deformed, but they're deformed not because of their bodies, not because of their religion, but because of legal discrimination. So you remove the discrimination, and Jews will be just like Christians, including actually assimilating and becoming Christian. And a lot of these arguments are probably arguments you've heard before. So Jews are not allowed to take up certain occupations. The guilds are closed to Jews, so there are very few Jews who are artisans. Jews aren't allowed to own property, and so they turn to tax collection and usury. And here you have, this is a somewhat famous painting, which is a really nasty painting. Now, I don't actually know an enormous amount about it, so I can't tell you what the headdress is of the man who's writing. If you look at the writing, it does look like it's Hebrew, so he might not look Jewish necessarily, but his face is dirty. The other man, though, is clearly marked in terms of his dress, the sneer, and that the way in which he's conspiratorially hanging over the other man as a Jewish tax collector. That's the concept. And the idea here is that they're evil and that they're doing something terrible. So that's the liberal argument is Jews are like everyone else, but they were forced to be different. And I'm going to push back against that. First of all, it's not true that certain Jews were not allowed to take up certain occupations or that the guilds were closed to Jews. Depends on where you are and what you're talking about. And simply because a law is on the books doesn't mean that it's actually enforced. Jews can own property. I've got plenty of examples of Jews in the medieval period owning everything from houses to vineyards, which they were not supposed to own because Jews are not supposed to make wine for Christians. That's both Jewish law and Christian law. Jews, and this is the most important thing, are not the only ones who are engaged in usury. Christians are actually the biggest practitioners of usury. Yes, it's true that as a Christian, you're not supposed to do it. But think about it for a second. The Catholic Church actually brings in enormous amounts of money through tithes. And what it does is it lends that money out. Not only the tax collectors themselves are working off of time and sending money to Rome, and lending money, therefore, to the church, but the church turns around and does it. Not only that, but you have groups in various Christian countries, such as the Cohorzans in France and the Lombards in the Italian peninsula, who are financing all kinds of ventures, including what will become colonial ventures. So the idea here that Jews somehow or another are the biggest practitioners of usury is just, I don't even really know what to say about it except that it's propaganda. Not only that, and I think this is the most interesting thing that's happened in the last 20 years, medieval scholars have demonstrated that medieval economic actors never did one thing. You live in a subsistence economy, meaning that you really have to make your own food. You have to do a variety of things to protect yourself from bad weather, bad harvests, and what have you, so that almost everybody is doing many things, meaning that Jews who are involved in usury also were doing a variety of other things. So it's not the case that Jews either only pursue usury as their only occupation, because that's not sustainable. The markets for lending money are too small, and they couldn't get their own food by doing that. They have to make their own food. But Christians are also involved in this. So I think what it does essentially is remind us that there's this really unhealthy preoccupation with wealthy people that, on the one hand, capitalism focuses on, and on the other hand, this notion that the couple of Jews that are wealthy, and there are some Jews who become wealthy over this 1,000-year period, that they are somehow representative of the entire Jewish community. And so here you see an anti-Semitic postcard. It's a reference to the five sons of the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds are held up constantly, even in scholarship today, as the example of wealth. And in fact, most Jews are not wealthy. And so I want to say something in the time remaining about that. Let me just see if, yeah, right. So Jews are an insignificant minority, and really, I think it says more about the majority of Germans that they are so focused on Jewish economic behavior, because it tells you something about Germans or German Christians rather than German Jews. The demographic significance of rich Jews, as I was saying, lies more in their exceptional status, both as examples of upward mobility in the 19th century, and the confirmation bias that supports a continued preoccupation with Jewish power and profit. So let's just talk for a second about the fact that it's really hard to prove if Jews were wealthy or not, or what the extent of Jewish wealth was. Before German unification in 1871, demographic studies of the Jewish population were often based on irregular collection practices. It's not that there were annual attempts to figure out what Jews were doing in the economy, but also problematic counting methods. So let me give you an example of this confessional data that was politically manipulated. In 1843, the Prussian Interior Minister, Adolf Heinrich Graf von Arnim, demanded that the Royal Prussian Statistical Bureau furnish evidence that most Prussian Jews were involved, and this is the order that he gives, quote, in petty haggling and junk dealing. And the only way that the Statistical Bureau could do that was by literally falsifying their evidence. So it's really hard to trust a lot of the evidence we have, and we don't have all that much. And I could go through and give you other examples. For example, some of the categories are really problematic. Jews are represented as not working very much. And that fits this notion that Jews don't work with their hands, don't work in general, but live off of usury. When in fact, these classificatory categories that the statistical bureaus in various parts of Germany use are about trying to demonstrate that Jews are somehow lazy but predatory, when in fact that's really not true. So let me just give you an example of that. It's true that Jews are less represented in the industrial workforce and in the agricultural, rural land force. But it doesn't mean they're not manual laborers. They just don't get recorded that way. So let me give you this example. In 1907, 31% of the German Jewish workforce worked with their hands, but they worked as bakers, butchers, carpenters, cleaners, wallpaperers, leather workers, plumbers, tailors, upholsterers, and things like that. In other words, those are the artisans that supposedly were never able to get work from the guilds. So where does that leave us? What if we were to flip this argument for a second and focus on the Jewish poor rather than the Jewish wealthy, since I would argue that more people who were Jewish were poor, not only before this tremendous transformation of German society that included Jews becoming part of the middle class, but more generally, Jews had poor. How do we know that? Well, we know that because there are these benevolent societies. The benevolent societies, I want to insist on calling them that because the notion of charity is a Christian concept. It has to do with loving humanity. Philanthropy is also, I think, a really bad word for at least something that's inspired by the Jewish religion and has to do with helping poor people. Because from a Jewish perspective, tzedakah is about social justice. It's about justice before God, but it's also about seeing what is happening to your fellow person and taking care of them. So I give you an example of an early modern German Jewish commentator who argued that he who shuts his eyes to the needs of others is called wicked and is looked upon as if he worships idols. So this notion of justice is the way that Jewish communities are organized. And those benevolent societies are not just a way to redistribute from the wealthy, the better off, to the poor. They are also a way to conserve Jewish values. And I think that's really important, especially during the period of time from the 18th century. And you can see here, I just give you an example of the Jewish community hitting people up at holidays, which most Jewish communities still do. But the idea is that from that period until, I would say, the Weimar Republic, these benevolent societies are really quite skilled at trying to serve people inside of the communities. And we know that they were very active, so we know that there were a lot of poor people. So if I just give you some of my own research, and I'm gonna whip through this since I'm running out of time, but I went ahead and tried to count people using different primary as well as scholarly sources. So the red line, I don't know why it's not showing up in the legend, but the red line is simply Jews as a percentage of the city of Berlin. That remains relatively stable, although by the time you get to Weimar, you're talking about 5%. And it's that little bump from 1880 something to 1900, where a lot of people are leaving West Prussia and going to Berlin because of these anti-Semitic riots that feeds this kind of internal migration. So it's a relatively large community for German Jewish standards, but it is a very small community. They make up anywhere from 2 to 4% of the city's population. Now, if you take a look at the total expenditure, that blue line, you see that there's actually a lot of money that's being redistributed inside of the community. And that over time, the subsidy from the Jewish community, which is a way of saying, and I had to count this by looking at various benevolent societies and totting things up, and so that's why there's some data that's missing. But the point I would try and make is that over time, these subsidies become more important because the community itself, by asking people to contribute on, say, Yom Kippur or Purim, it's not enough money. They become more reliant on wealthy people. If you take a look at this graph, what you see here is that there are one-time payments that the community is making, up to 50 marks by 1910. There's continual support for people who are truly impoverished. And it doesn't go up, although you have inflationary pressures, and that is not a good thing. In fact, what you see is in certain periods, that yellow line, the shamefaced poor, is a polite way of saying people who used to be wealthy but are down at the heels and so don't want to be recognized as poor. And they are given money through really interesting and sometimes even anonymous methods that don't make them feel ashamed of themselves. But what you can see here is that over time, they become more important than people who never were wealthy and didn't lose their fortune. There's far too much money going out to them. So I don't have time, but I could spend a lot more time talking to you about the research that I did. So what I'll simply say is that when you take a look at this redistributive practice and the inflationary pressures, what we see is that the Jewish community can't meet the needs of the Jewish poor. And the cost of food rises more quickly. And so this idea that the community is increasingly reliant on donations becomes really important. They are not able to bring the number of poor down. About 19% by my calculations of Berlin's total Jewish population is poor. And when I say poor, it is a definition that the Jewish community gives that it would mean their caloric intake would be below what would sustain a human being. In other words, it's a really restrictive category for poor people. You're saying that 20% are poor, it's probably more like 30 to 40%. And that's by the time you get to World War I. So we're talking about a lot of people who are poor in this community. We're also talking about a community that can, over time, no longer actually rely on donations from individuals. It turns increasingly to people who are wealthy. And what that does is it means that there are more, the costs of giving money are higher because you have to do galas and things like that to make wealthy people feel wanted and important. So you get buildings like this one, the new Jewish hospital in Wedding, in the Iranische Straße, because they can put their names on it. They can say that they donated. There's a physical representation of their power and wealth, and it becomes less about actual poor people and more about these benevolent societies surviving. So there's a kind of means ends problem. In order to finance these things, you need an endowment, but the endowment becomes the end rather than the people the endowment is supposed to serve. At the same time, Jews start to look more like Christians. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Jewish women were very involved in Jewish benevolent work, and if you compare it to Christians, Christian women were not involved. But over time, as Jews acculturate, Jewish women are pushed out. Not only that, but tzedakah is no longer a kind of principle that a lot of the benevolent societies and the community itself in Berlin talks about. If you just read their annual reports, they don't even mention Jewish religious principles by the time you get to the 1890s. So I would end with this somewhat provocative suggestion that the more discrimination there was, the more Jewish the Berlin Jewish community was, the more tolerant German society as a whole became, the less Jewish people became. And if you go back to this notion of greed versus generosity, I think what you're seeing is that everybody likes money. Jews are no different than anyone else. And there is nothing particularly Jewish about the way in which the German Jewish community looks by the time you get to World War I. I think, Magda, I will stop there.
Wonderful. What's going on with my... Oh. Okay, now here I am back. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for the fascinating lecture. It was amazing. And I have a few questions. I would also like to remind the audience that you have a chance to ask your question and write it down in the Q&A box. I will maybe start from the end, actually.
Okay.
Where you mentioned that tzedakah and the welfare system. This actually really reminds me this anti-Semitism and especially the anti-Semitic tendencies in Poland in the interwar time, where actually it is estimated that over 50% of the Jewish population was living on the welfare help. At some point, it was even like up to 75% of the population. So, of course, this was a huge amount of the community. Nevertheless, people who, of course, we would nowadays label them as anti-Semites, they were always talking about the Jews and money. So, and this, on the other hand, there's also this unhealthy fascination with Jewish wealth and Jews and money. This also kind of reminds me the story of that we kind of see a lot nowadays, where this fascination with the successful stories of immigrants in the America, where of course nobody sees that where there is one successful immigrant, there are perhaps 100 stories that of immigrants who, of course, struggled a lot, and I think we can say the same about the about Jews and money and wealth. Anyway, I have actually one question. You mentioned the usury and also the Jay-Z, that there are still those similar statements about Jews and money. We see them a lot. Yeah, you mentioned that Jay-Z. I think I saw this somewhere also by Kanye West,
Yeah.
another pop culture star, but also actually by, in more serious approaches, like politicians on both sides of the American political scene. And my question is, um, those anti-Semitic slurs, were they actually transplanted straight from Europe and from the anti-Semitism, we can say maybe in the from Germany before the 1939, or is there maybe some new element that was added in America to those accusations?
All right. Let me first. I just want to respond to what you were saying about Poland and this notion that Jews are poverty stricken, which most Jews are in Europe until market economies start to grow. And usually what happens is that it goes hand in hand with a liberalization of the legal restrictions on Jews. The first explanation is always, well, Jews are impoverished because they're cursed, because they're devious and greedy, they're lazy, very important, especially in a Polish context. They don't work with their hands, they're not farmers, et cetera, and so forth. That basic argument is used when Jews are wealthy, or let's say middle class. They love money. They don't work. They live lives of luxury. And so even though in the beginning the argument is that Jews are a drain on the state, either because they're criminal in some way, they're so poverty stricken that they've turned to criminality, or because what they're really doing is a form of arbitrage that's not good because it's immoral. Whatever the argument is a utilitarian one about Jews being a drain. Then that flips, all of that evidence changes, and people say, well, they're still a drain, they're just parasitic. So I think the constant here is this notion of usury on the one hand. There's something about money itself, and this idea that anti-Semitic thought is so protean that it doesn't make a difference what the evidence is. As soon as so, I remember having a conversation with a very wealthy Jewish man who came from a German Jewish family, and he basically said to me, "Jews are really good with money. My ancestors had a bank in southern Germany, and they're really good at it." And I said, "Well, but that's your particular family. Not everybody was good at this. And how do you explain, for example, Jewish poverty?" And he said, "Well, it's very simple. Jamie Dimon is Jewish and he's very successful." And the point is, Jamie Dimon is not Jewish. He is ethnically perhaps other from a Protestant perspective because he's of Greek heritage, but he is not Jewish. There's nothing, I mean, you can bring up any kind of evidence you like and make it serve the ends. And the ends, I think, are always trying to demonstrate that there's something strange about Jews, number one. And I think that's the Christian tradition. I'm not a historian of America, but I do think that the Christian tradition is something that the European inflection of it is obviously what you get here. And then, I mean, if you think about African American, I think there's all kinds of kinships because of the particular version of Protestantism that is forced upon African Americans, and so the notion of slavery and things like that. But I still think that there's this notion of usury that's really important in people's lives. It also becomes a question of capitalism because, I mean, in the Jay-Z song, he talks about credit. Credit is a really big part of American capitalism, less so, say, in Germany. But it is the way that we fund projects, and it is also the way that people can get into debt. And markets are really impersonal. So wouldn't it be great if you could say that there's a person who's making you suffer. It's not a bank, it's Jamie Dimon, and Jamie Dimon is Jewish. None of that is true, but it's far more satisfying psychologically, I would argue, than some kind of larger argument that would bore you to tears about how markets fail.
Great. Thank you. And we have actually one question right now, and this is from my colleague, David Brown. Jonathan, would you like to read the question or should I read it?
Why don't you read it?
Okay. So, okay. Thanks, Jonathan. That was so interesting. Some of it made me think of Götz Ali's book, Why the Germans, Why the Jews, which, if I understood it, argued that German anti-Semitism is in part explained by jealousy over social and economic mobility in the late 19th and early 20th century. Mobility is increasing across society, but it's happening faster for the Jews, and this leads to resentment. That's the question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I don't think Ali is right. I understand. So he's taking this Nietzschean idea that people experience resentment, rancor against other people when they're successful. Of course, Nietzsche employs it to talk about Jews in a very anti-Semitic way. Jews want to take revenge on Christians for being treated poorly. And he goes very far with that. So I think that the inspiration for the Ali book is really kind of problematic. I know what he's getting at, though, and what I would say something slightly different. Most people don't really understand how capitalism works in the 19th century. I would say that's probably true even today. We have some understanding of the trade-offs you make. You know, you go and you buy your coffee at Starbucks, and you can get the same coffee at the same Starbucks, and it's always going to taste the same, and it's better than whatever other coffee or something like that. Or alternatively, it's more convenient, even though it's less expensive or more expensive than whatever it is, right? So there's all sorts of calculations we make, but I think it's really hard on a larger scale for people to understand basic shifts. We're going through one right now with AI. It's really not clear how this is going to play out, but it seems to me that a lot of white collar workers are going to be put out of business. All the sort of data entry stuff that I had to do by hand, if archivists could, it's never going to happen, but digitize and make searchable, and AI was good enough to do it, instead of me having to go through all these reports by hand over a period of 100 years, an AI could do it in a matter of minutes. So you don't need me. You need me to analyze it. All that work is going to get converted. People are going to go out of business. Who are they going to blame? And I think that's the whole point. They're not going to sit there and say there are structural arguments here. They're going to see that another social group is doing well. And that social group might be identified by ethnicity, religion, or it could be women. Gender is always playing, I think, an important dynamic. And then, you could also just talk about people like we talk about people in tech. Certain parts of the economy, we're willing to tolerate that more, but it's far more satisfying to blame a certain group of people who is easily identifiable. And I think it's about, in other words, zero-sum concepts. If you believe, and I'm not saying I do, I'm just saying that if you believe that capitalism is a good thing, and you believe that the way it works is that mutually beneficial for us to trade with each other, which is not something that our president believes, but nevertheless, if we both enrich each other through our work and our interdependence, then the pie doesn't stay static. The pie gets bigger all the time. And I think it's this notion that people have, not of resentment of other people because they have more, but because they think that there's a static amount of good. And if those people have it, it means I have to have less. And I think that's what's so hard for people to understand.
I think this what you just mentioned about AI, and also that this can happen with any particular ethnic group. This makes me actually thinking about the middleman syndrome, or where in different societies one ethnic group can play the role of middleman, and of course in this way they draw more attention and also more backlash. So I would say here that, of course, the Jews in America, earlier in Europe, but also this happened with Indians in Uganda or other communities where they were also particularly economically active. So yeah, and there is also another question. Could you also comment on the idea of middle agent theory? Which is kind of the same, actually, as an explanatory model of anti-Semitism, a sort of materialist explanation that I first read about in a JFREJ training, which is the Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. So okay. They do a training about anti-Semitism.
All right, I'm not familiar with the training, but I have some issues with that particular set of arguments. So there's no question that Jews very often are ridiculed for not. I'm trying to frame it in terms of production. Early capitalism is all about making things. You know, people like Daniel Boone makes his own house, right? You know, we're supposed to make things. Abraham Lincoln makes a log cabin, and that's good capitalism. It's also some weird American dream of being self-sufficient as a man, but uh, you're not interdependent. You're not dependent on other people. When in fact, that's not at all how things work. But the argument then is that you can't trust intermediaries. And Jews play some kind of role as intermediaries. And one of the favorite things that people like to say, to go back to the Jay-Z argument, is Jews are involved with certain forms of music. They actually make certain forms of music, but it is sold to other people. So, for example, Irving Berlin and people like this make songs about Christmas. Jews are involved in basically the blues industry, Motown and things like that. They don't actually make the music. It doesn't make a difference how you talk about it, whether or not Jews make music or sell music. They're seen as intermediaries and there's something wrong with them. I actually like Georg Simmel, I mean, he was of Jewish extract, but I don't think there's anything Jewish about him except for the fact that even his close friends were anti-Semitic towards him because he was born into a converted family. And I don't know how much Jewishness there was there, but he has an argument that the people that you're talking about, for example, the Indians in Uganda, the Jews in certain kinds of economic contexts, they are actually strangers. And they stand in for a world that you physically, but also in terms of the consumer goods that they make available to you, it's out of your reach. And so it's exotic in a good way, but it's also exotic in a bad way. And that difference is what troubles people. So that's, I would say, part of it, because if you sort of flip it and think, well, if from a Christian perspective, Jesus is an intermediary in a lot of ways, or if you're Catholic, priests are, what's wrong with people who mediate? What's the problem here? And I think, again, it goes back to not understanding how capitalism functions and also seeing people as different.
Thank you. And another question, I will just read the entire comment. Most interesting overview. I will need to study your most interesting talk. Our maternal grandparents from Breslau were upwardly mobile, assimilated in Berlin to 1939. Born in South Africa, we saw Jews rich and poor from East and West in Europe. In the diverse groups you identify, very rich, poor, seen as greedy and grasping, community caring. Your expert eyes would show much as this community grew and shrunk from times under British Africans, now Black multiracialism, with anti-Semitism at all times.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my reaction to that is that anywhere you can find, since I'm familiar with Christianity, I might be overstating this, but I would say anywhere you can find Christianity and capitalism, you're going to find that they mutually reinforce this notion of Jews as greedy and grasping, no matter if the Jews are poor, if they're wealthy, if they're scholars. How did I come into this? I'll be very honest, it's very simple. My first book my dissertation was really just about trying to understand East Germany. I had been an economic journalist, and everything I was reporting on while Germany was being unified was all the sorts of financial ways in which it was being unified, not just the conversion of the East Germans accepting the West German mark, but also all the weird fiscal things that were being done to finance it because it was very expensive. And I thought, okay, that how people think about money is really interesting. So I went to go speak to one of the more important German historians of social democracy and things like that. He was a great guy and a really brilliant man. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, I know why you're writing about money." And I like was obviously I was young, I was incredibly innocent, and I said, "What do you mean?" And he went like this, which in German, of course, means money, Jewish. And I was floored. So in a way, this project is all about the durability of these really nasty linkages that people have in their minds.
Right, thank you. And yeah, as I see, it's already after 1 o'clock. However, one of the traditions of these lectures is always trying to see these connections between those different overarching topics. And for me, I think nothing interconnects more than economics and migration. We see so many those connecting dots in those two topics. Please treat it as the as a summary of the lecture and also your final comments.
I'm not sure how I could connect the migration. I mean, on the receiving end, like I was saying, you could make the argument that wherever there's capitalism and Christianity, you're going to find these tropes, and that people are going to make the connections because even if they don't believe them, or even if they're trying to be anti-Semitic, they're very powerful ways in which we understand how economics function and what the role of particular confessional or ethnic groups are. So in that sense, no matter where we go in the world at this point, I think, European colonialism has made it possible for these tropes to be exported to other parts of the world, including non-Christian ones. But I'm not sure I can really say very much about migration. I mean, obviously, one of the things when you talk about the poor in German Jewry, a lot of poor people migrate to the Americas. I know we tend to focus, and I know that Tobias was focused on, since he's a historian of American Jewry, very much focused on that transatlantic North American part. But there are a lot of German Jews. In fact, one of the people who wrote, associated with the Leo Baeck Institute, who wrote a really important book, was born in Guatemala to German Jewish parents who came from Posen, and then they re-emigrated to Germany. And the reason for that was they couldn't make a go of it, but it actually turned out to be really important because the reason that Alto Prince was able to come to the United States was because his father had somehow or another gotten US citizenship. So when the Nazis arrested him in 1938, he was able to come to the United States, thought of migration as a possibility. That just shows you how German Jews were, because lots of Germans were going to South America and to America. So I think part of my point would be that German Jews were very German, and they followed in the same kind of economic and migration paths that Germans did, German Christians.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm really looking forward to your new book. And I would also like to thank to our audience. And we will continue in a month with the topic of Austria. Thank you very much and
Thank
have a
you.
nice day.
Thank you.